Okay. Good morning, 12s. How are you? So let's continuing on with the nervous system. What do we talk about? We talked about general anatomy of the nervous system. What do? We talked about the nerves that come out. We talked about the central nervous system, which is your brain, your spinal cord. We talked about the peripherally nervous system, which is all the stuff that goes to your periphery, all the nerves that go to your periphery. We talked about the autonomic nervous system. That's the involuntary one that controls the stomach and the liver and the eyes and the salivary glands and all the things. We talked about the somatic nervous system. That's the one that you have conscious control over. Look, there's you making a decision to move your arm or to press. What is that? That's a button that looks like one of those Bluetooth speakers. You're pressing the button to turn on the Bluetooth speaker. We talked about parts of the brain, the cerebrum. That's that part that makes us human. It makes the decisions. It uses memories to make associations and connections. We talked about the cerebellum, which is the balance area. We talked about the pons, which filters out all the noise. Your clothes rubbing against you. It filters out background sounds like the aquarium running over there. I don't even hear it anymore. We talked about the medulla oblongata, which controls the breathing and stuff. And now let's talk about impulse transmission. So this is how do those signals traveling from the central nervous system get down out of your brain and then get out into your arms, into your things? How do they travel along the nerves? So first, let's define some things. First, let's talk about the nerves. First, let's talk about the anatomy of the nerves. So that's over here, nerve. So a nerve is a bundle of neurons. Okay, and a mixed nerve, there's is a bundle of motor neurons and sensory neurons. So what are neurons? What are neurons? Well, neurons are a single nerve cell. Okay, and they have three parts. These cells have, number one, they have something called a cell body. That's where the nucleus is, where the organelles are, mitochondria, there's some mitochondria in there. All that stuff is in there that runs the cell, keeps the cell alive, keeps the neuron alive. You don't want to wreck your neuron cell body because then, that neuron dies. For a long time, people thought that all the neurons that you have for life, that we don't grow neurons, that neurons don't grow, nerve cells don't grow, like you're born with that many nerve cells. But now we know that they grow very slowly, and over time, you replace a lot of your nerve cells. So whereas like skin cells, we're constantly replacing. People that have muscle cells and nerve cells, we don't replace. We're sort of born with them. We know now that we do. I think it's like the longest side. This is all wrong. This is wrong, and it has nothing to do with this. But I'm gonna say wrong. This is probably wrong, but I think it's 15 years. About 15 years. So every 15 years, you're a new person. It's an all new. So you guys are what, 16? You're in your first year of being on all your new cells. I'm already a few new cells in. Anyways, so they have a cell body, and let's look at there we go. There's a cell body, and then there's three types of neurons. So there's three parts to a neuron. They have a cell body. They have a dendrite, which conducts impulses toward the cell body, and an axon, which conducts impulses away from the cell body. And there are three types of neurons. So this is a motor neuron. And so motor neurons have really long axons. So the bit that conducts impulses away from the cell body is really long. Sensory neurons are the other way. They have a longer dendrite. Dendrite conducts impulses to the cell body, and they have a shorter axon. And interneurons they connect these two together. They're in your spinal cord, and they connect two together. And yeah, that's good. Now, in vertebrates, advanced, wonderful vertebrates like us, we have long, our neurons, some of your neurons are really long. Some of the ones that run to your toes, that's going to be a long, axon and a long dendrite on the sensory ones coming back. Now, as a result, it might take too long for the impulses to travel. Like, you don't feel I'm touching my toe, I feel it right away, but if it's a long way to go. Anyways, so what we've got these things called myelin sheaths. You could see them here over the axon. And what they do is basically they're like a shortcut. The impulse goes dunk, 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 dunk. It doesn't have to travel the entire length. And what these are is they are special cells called Schwann cells. There's a Schwann cell nucleus. They wrap around and they're fatty. They're made of fat. They're fatty. They make a myelin sheath. That's the axon in there. And the little spaces in between where the impulses happen are called the nodes of Ranvier. And basically they speed up impulse transmission. They also prevent ions from one neuron affecting another neuron. So there's lots of neurons running together. So if we look here, do we have his nerves over here? So here's nerve. So a nerve is a bundle of neurons. Can we zoom in more on that? There we go. So is a bundle of neurons. So see, there's myelinated neuron cells and unmyelinated. And anyways, they prevent each other from cross-contaminating, sort of cross-sending signals to each other. That's what those myelin sheaths do. If you're ever asked about a myelin sheath, there you go. Now you know. Okay. We talked about reflex arc. So those three neurons play a part in the reflex arc. We talked about it last time, but there's a big stimulus on a sensory dendrite. So a sensory neuron has a huge stimulus, whereas there's a sensory. And now, okay, so this will be a good moment to mention. The strength of stimulus is always the same running along a neuron. It's always identical. It's always the same because neurons are sort of all or none. They fire everything. They're like, I'm on, and then they're off. What controls the strength of a stimulus is how many neurons get fired. So if we look in the nerve, say this nerve is going out to the periphery. I don't know if it says there's sensory nerves going in here, and this is a mixed nerve. There's sensory and motor neurons going out in and out. So say all of these fire. It's a huge, you touched a hot wall, a hot plate. That's a big signal, and that triggers. So each individual neuron fires exactly the same always, whether big stimulus or small stimulus, but it's how many of those that are firing that controls the strength of the stimulus, okay? So if there's a big enough stimulus, what will happen is the signal will travel down the sensory neuron. It'll arc across the interneuron and go straight out of the motor neuron. So it'll go in and out and move your arm away from the fire or whatever it is. It'll go to an effector. Motor neurons attached to effectors. Effectors are either muscles or glands. So, I don't know, you'll secrete something. Probably you'll secrete the stuff that helps you heal from burns. That's a reflex arc, and basically what it does is it cuts out the central nervous system because the nervous system is a little bit slow because, you touch a hot thing. If your central nervous system was in play, then your cerebrum would be in play, and it would be like, oh, that's a hot plate. That's hot. I associate good things with heat, but I also associate bad. Oh, I better move my arm. That's how it works. Whereas the reflex arc is like, hot, away. So you can see it's a lot faster. Okay, so how do these signals how do these signals travel along these neurons? They're electrical. Now, they work on a potential. So a potential is a difference in charge. It doesn't mean actually a difference like positive, negative. It can be more positive, more negative. So a difference in ion concentrations. Oh, we're back to those concentration things, diffusion. Active transport, passive transport. So active transport and passive transport play a huge role in this. So make sure you know what I'm saying, you know what I mean. So what happens is, normally there is something called a resting potential across a nerve, okay? So this is an axon. That's the axon membrane there. That's the yellow is the inside of the axon, and that's the outside of the axon. The outside is slightly positively charged. The inside is slightly negatively charged. There is a potential across here of 65 microvolts. Now, that's what it says in the workbook. It says 65 microvolts. In other places, I read 70 microvolts. So let's say about 67.5 microvolts. Split the difference in there. 70, 65. That's resting potential. So now what happens is there's a stimulus. Things get triggered at the sensory end, let's say, or if this is a motor neuron in the dendrite, a signal is going out. Anyways, what happens is the first thing that happens is how this resting potential is maintained. Here so here's the inside of the axon. Here's the outside, and how it's maintained is inside. There are some potassium ions and some sodium ions, okay? And outside, there's some potassium ions and some sodium ions, but way more sodium ions, way more, greater concentration of sodium ions. So as a result, because sodium ions are positively charged, so are potassium ions. That's where it gets a little bit confusing. But here, the potassium ions, there's also negative chlorine ions in here, and the chlorine cancels out the potassium. So here you've got great concentration of sodium, lots of positive charge. Here you've got positive charge and negative charge. So overall, there's a negativer charge inside than outside, okay, of 65 millivolts. So what happens is stimulus happens, and channels open along the membrane. Potassium channels and sodium channels. So this is resting potential. They're closed, but when there's an action potential, they open. So here we're looking at, this is minus 70 millivolts. So this is resting potential. This is the charge, basically, the potential across the membrane. And so what's happening? So there's a stimulus, and the stimulus, it can't be just a little bit. It has to be, to trigger the all or none, the stimulus has to sort of reach a threshold. And the stimulus can be chemical or physical, right? Threshold is reached, and so what happens is those sodium and potassium channels open. Now, the concentrations of sodium and potassium are different across these. So when those channels open through diffusion, passive transport, there's no ATP involved right now, the sodium will go in, the potassium will go out. And what will happen is the potential will start to change. So now the potassium channels are late. They open later. So first is the sodium channel. So sodium starts rushing inside the axon, and what was negative becomes depolarized and becomes positive. So now the inside has a positive charge, and the potassium ions are also now starting to come out. And the potassium ions start to come out, and they start to return things back to normal. Except they're not totally back to normal. So the potential is back to normal, but now potassium ions are on the outside and sodium ions are on the inside. And has been transmitted. Now what happens is this change in potential triggers the channels next door to open, which triggers the channels next door to open, which triggers the channels next door and next door and next door and next door. And lo and behold, the action potential travels down the nerve. Now, why doesn't it go backwards? Because it could go backwards, but it doesn't go backwards because we're in this state right now where the potential is the same, but the potassium ions are on that side and the sodium ions are on that side. They're wrong. They can't be triggered. And so what turns on here to return things back to resting potential are now pumps. So these are active transport and they pump potassium back to the inside and sodium back to the outside slowly. They're like diesel pumps now. And they're pumping the things back and forth and returning things to resting potential. This takes ATP. While they're doing that, so here they are, they're doing that, the signal can't travel backwards. That's why the signal only travels one way. So that's how the signal goes. So read more about that, more in detail, but that's the general gist of it. Important things to know: all or none response. Potassium sodium pumps, potassium sodium gates or channels. Those are different things. Which ones require ATP, which ones don't? What is a resting potential? What is a action potential? And what is a repolarization? So we got depolarization. What happens in depolarization? What's going on here? Sodium channels and potassium channels are open here. The sodium channels actually close. Sodium gates remain open. Potassium gates remain open. Things get restored. At some point, they close. You guys figure it out in more detail. Mr. K's kind of too tired and his brain's mush. Now, you have those different types of neurons, so things have to jump across the neurons because the neuron ends and another neuron begins. This is called synaptic transmission. It's a lot slower. So this is, let's say, this is the axon of a motor neuron, and this is the receptor of another, or maybe this is a cell. This looks like it's a cell, or another neuron. So what happens here is the action potential reaches the end, and what happens is it actually triggers calcium channels to now open. Calcium goes into the end. This is the synapse. The synapse is kind of this space in between. It's this whole actually area. The synaptic cleft is the space in between. Anyways, calcium goes in, and there are vesicles. Remember vesicles from your parts of a cell thing. And proteins that hold these vesicles. The calcium, when it attaches to the proteins shrink, and the proteins are attached here to the membrane, what's called the presynaptic membrane, and the vesicles. And when they shrink, they spit the vesicles out. Exocytosis happens, and neurotransmitter gets shot out into the synaptic cleft. This is the postsynaptic membrane, and in the postsynaptic membrane are receptors for the neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter triggers the receptors, and that triggers an action potential to go down and continue. It might not trigger an action potential. It might actually do the opposite. Some neurotransmitters depress the action, but they make the action potential not happen. Some make them happen. Drugs. This is drugs. A lot of drugs pretend to be these neurotransmitters. So they either make action potentials, oh, you feel good, or they reduce action potentials, you feel good, but you're more relaxed, whatever. This neurotransmitter, it's stuck in these proteins here, and it's making the action potential go. What has to happen is an enzyme has to come along and remove this neurotransmitter, break it down so that the signal is not being sent. Again, drugs inhibit sometimes this enzyme. So you get good feelings going, and the good feelings keep going because the enzyme can't remove them because the drug is an inhibitor that's blocking the active site of the enzyme. And then some drugs trigger these, like crank will trigger these things and keep sending them and actually destroy these so that you can't feel good again, only you take crank again. That whole thing. So read about that. Next, this is where the drugs work, because this is the parasympathetic, the autonomic nervous system. That's that nervous system that controls your heart rate, your breathing, and you either get excited or you don't get. So sympathetic, the sympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system promotes active body functions. So those are stimulants. And you have noradrenaline, that's the neurotransmitter. Where is it? Neurotransmitter. So that's noradrenaline that increases action potentials. Okay, so here is sympathetic. So, pupils dilate, your heart rate increases, your airways open, sweat glands, you sweat more, all of these things. That's stimulants. Parasympathetic does the opposite. It works against it. It uses a different neurotransmitter. It uses acetylcholine. So in those synapses is acetylcholine that's released. And it does the opposite. So it will increase digestion. It will slow your heart rate, slow things. So there are things that are depressants that do the opposite. There are normal parts of your of your nervous system, and this is how your body controls its functions. Is with these with the autonomic nervous system. You don't control this. I mean, if you take drugs, then you're sort of controlling it. And the drugs, what they do is they work in those synapses, and they wreck stuff. So they inhibit the protein. So you could inhibit the protein that takes away acetylcholine, which is the parasympathetic neurotransmitter, the depressant. So you stay awake longer. Caffeine works kind of that way. So it's not actually stimulating you, it's just not letting you calm yourself down. An example. So read about that, look at that. You guys there's some assignment that I gave you yesterday. Something about, what was it about? Oh, the kid brain. You're supposed to watch videos and write a critique, an intelligent critique. So you can write about these things now in your intelligent critique. So you need to talk about this stuff in it. Don't just be like, I felt that it was really good, and I think it's so amazing how the brain works. No, don't. I mean, you can say that. That's fine. But if that's all your thing is. And that's it. That's all the notes on the nervous system. So you just go over those until Friday. Friday, we're going to have a quiz on this. It's going to be small. It's only 25 marks, 15 multiple choice, 10 written, and written online. Make sure you find the time. Don't, like, there's still people coming to me now. Oh, I forgot to write the quiz. I did. The quizzes are on Friday. Okay. And it's going to be, I was kind of flaky on the time, but it's going to be the same time that we did before, because you guys have a class in the morning and some of you have a class in the afternoon, so it'll be in that flex time. I know some of you have clubs and stuff. If you have clubs and stuff, let me know and email me, and we'll find a time for you to do it after school, okay? Okay.